I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to episode 152 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. Today we have our first two-part interview with Dr. Mark Aldridge. He has written the definitive book, Hercule Poirot, the greatest detective in the world.
Dr. Mark Aldridge is an academic, speaker, and historian specializing in the world of Agatha Christie. He is a regular speaker at Agatha Christie events and often undertakes media appearances. He is also a senior lecturer in film and television at Solent University in Southampton, UK. Agatha Christie's Poirot, the greatest detective in the world. Hercule Poirot has had a near-permanent presence in the public eye ever since the 1920 publication of The Mysterious Affair at Styles. The detective who solves diabolical crimes using his, quote, little gray cells, unquote, has enamored audiences not only in the original novels, short stories, and plays, but also across radio, television, and movies. From Agatha Christie's earliest conceptions and publication history to forays on the stage and screen, the history of Poirot is as fascinating as it is enduring. Mark Aldridge tells this story decade by decade, exploring and analyzing Poirot's many and often wildly different appearances, following the detective to present day when he is enjoying a worldwide renaissance. Packed with original research, never-before-published correspondence, and images from Agatha Christie archives, Agatha Christie's Poirot will delight fans of Hercule Poirot and mystery lovers alike.
We would like to welcome Mark Aldridge to the program. He has a wonderful book out celebrating 100 years of Agatha Christie, and his book is called Poirot, the greatest detective in the world. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to have another excuse to talk about Poirot for a little while.
So are we. Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes shared a lot of characteristics. Why do you think characters such as these are desirable in mystery novels?
I think that's a really good question because we know that Sherlock Holmes was a big influence on Agatha Christie when creating Poirot. And especially in the earlier books, we get a real sense of Hastings being very much like Watson and Poirot being very much like Sherlock Holmes. And I think what they can really bring to the reader and the person writing the mystery is that they manage to make things seem almost obvious by the time they explain them because they see things in a different way, in a way that actually the reader is not going to have experienced it or noticed perhaps particular clues or elements of the mystery. So I think that's the big thing about them, actually, is that they are quirky characters, that they aren't sort of like everybody else, and that they're able to sort of go, but this is so obvious. How can you not work this out, that this and this and this combined mean that this must be the solution? You don't necessarily feel a bit stupid by the end, but you do feel a bit like, oh, I see. If I'd thought about it in that way, I would have seen the clues. So I think that's what it is about them, that they see things in a different way, and are nice and quirky in their own way as well. And it's good for the reader to go, oh, I can see it now. I can understand how this all comes together.
I almost feel that some of the books had to be almost written backward, that the solution was figured out and then built a story around that.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting that when John Curran, who wrote about Agatha Christie's notebooks, when he was going through them, He did an amazing job, by the way, because I've gone through them, and how we could read her handwriting, I really couldn't say. He worked out something really interesting, which is that she didn't seem to have a system. So she had different systems. So sometimes she would work back from a solution. She might have an idea in mind and sort of work up to that. But there's a surprising number of novels that she wrote where she seems to have been working out different ways that the crime could have been committed, or that different murderers, different ways that it could be structured as she's sort of going along. So she might work out notes that have got several different ways for the story to be told, which I think is really interesting. And it shows how she could actually think of a million different ways to tell another murder mystery story.
Both Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie came to hate their characters. As close as you are to the study, do you find yourself tiring of Poirot?
No, I couldn't tire of Poirot. Can you imagine? But I can understand. I think that Agatha Christie felt a bit constricted by him. I think that's what the big thing was that she felt that there were loads of things she wanted to do. I mean, she was so excited about doing things like her stage plays in the 1940s and 1950s in particular, that I think that she felt having to go back to Poirot for financial reasons as much as anything else. Certainly in the earlier days, it meant that she was fed up with him. She seemed to mellow to him a lot over the decades and didn't seem to have such a bad relationship with him towards the end. For me, no, not at all. But I've got to say, if you do read the Poirots all back to back, as I did, again, in preparation for this book, you do see the same character descriptions brought out repeatedly. Most books will have the same descriptions about him. You know, small with the egg-shaped head and tilting and all this stuff. So I can understand why you might get a bit fed up with giving that description all of the time and being stuck with this very fastidious character who, as Agatha Christie said herself, was the opposite to Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie was, she said, wildly untidy and not particularly well organised, and the complete opposite to the very sort of almost clinical Poirot who wanted everything right and everything in the right order. I don't know if that quite answered your question, but I'm not sick of him, and I'm not sure she really was by the end herself. There were certainly times that she was completely fed up with him, yeah.
With the demands of her fans, also the publishers, I think you're right. I think that that's what got to her.
Yeah, and you can understand, it's a lot of pressure, isn't it? To think, oh, well, I'm sort of tied to this big character. And Miss Marple was a much later creation, sort of almost a decade after Poirot. Certainly seen a lot less than Poirot was. You can understand that she starts to think, oh, do I have to do another one? But like I say, by the time we get to the 50s and the 60s, she doesn't really seem to mind so much. I think because she's proven herself, she doesn't actually have to use Poirot if she doesn't want to.
Sophie Hannah has been the official continuation author of Hercule Poirot. I just kind of wondered, do you have a feel for whether she channels Agatha more or does she channel Hercule more?
That's a really interesting one. And I think that it's definitely Poirot that she's channeling more. That's by Sophie's own about admission, but the way that she describes her process is that she knew is never going to write exactly like Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie has her own style. And to try and replicate that is, I think, a bit of a recipe for disaster, which Sophie soon realised. Which is why, if you've read any of them, they're narrated by Catchpool, a police inspector, who means that actually Sophie can have her own voice. And I actually would also say that I think that the types of mysteries that they are and the structure that they are aren't necessarily the same as Agatha Christie's always are. I don't know if she would agree with me, actually. Sophie does what I think is quite a modern approach to thrillers and mysteries, which is where they have a really high concept centerpiece, that there's one really good hook to get the reader on board, which Sophie is absolutely brilliant at. And you can see in her thrillers outside of Poirot that that's what she's great at. And you can see that in her Poirots as well, where there might be things like somebody coming and saying that Poirot has been writing letters, which he hasn't actually been writing, and accusing people of murder, and stuff about somebody going on a coach trip and being told that they're going to die from whatever. It's all quite big things that you might, as a reader, look at the description for and go, oh, wow, I want to know what that's all about. Agatha Christie does do that sometimes. Things like the ABC murders is a really good example of that. On the whole, they tend to be structured in a fairly straightforward way, whereas more modern mysteries and thrillers tend to open with a really big concept, a great big hook right at the beginning. And that's the way that Sophie approached them, which is absolutely, I don't know, the right way to do it, but it makes sense as a way to do it if you're publishing books in 2021 or whatever. So I think definitely her characterization of Poirot is very strong. She knows her Agatha Christie really well. She certainly knows Poirot really well. And I think that she manages to capture his character particularly well. So yeah, I think Poirot is the thing that she is really pushing forth more than sort of being Agatha Christie style, I would say.
We interview quite a few authors. When we ask them where they got their love of mysteries, 100% say that it was because of Agatha Christie. So she's just as relevant today as she was back then. For the most part, most of her stories were written during the Depression or the Roaring '20s. Why do you think that she remained so relevant in a more technical age?
There is certainly a timeless quality to her writing. Actually, often the broader context of whatever's happening in the world isn't always that important to the book. In fact, it tends not to be that important. And I think there are practical reasons for that as much as anything. I mean, the Second World War is not really discussed very much, even in the books that were coming out during the Second World War. Actually, it's referenced more once the war is over. And that's probably because she's writing these books often 2 years in advance of when they're actually available as a novel, because she writes them, they get seen by agents, they get sent out to magazines that might serialize them, then eventually they get serialized, and then there's maybe 6 months to a year after that when they actually come out as a novel. She was never able to really say, oh, well, this is what's happening in the world right now, because these books had to have application to the reader whenever they read them, whether it was in wartime, whether it was times of prosperity, whether it was in times of depression. So she's often talking about characters and situations that have a universality to them, that actually will work whenever you're reading them. So I think that's the big thing about her. And actually, I was speaking to someone the other day where we were saying that most of the time, people reading Agatha Christie don't even know when they were written, whether it was a 1960s one or a 1920s one. And it sort of doesn't matter. They're good quality pretty much from whenever you're going to be picking them up.
Yes, they are.
Murder never changes. Murder's the same, no matter what.
Do you personally have a favorite Poirot book? And if so, why did you choose that book?
I get asked it quite often, and my answer normally changes, which is such a cheat. But I would say that the one that I think particularly appealed to me when I first read it was the ABC Murders, because it's got this fantastic concept of seemingly random murders, but that they have a logic because they're in this, alphabetical order. And the solution to that is really fantastic, a really, really clever one. But also the way that it's worked out and that it's very tense, a bit like a thriller at times, as well as being a murder mystery. So that's one that I've returned to probably most frequently. But actually, in writing the book in particular, what I found is that I've really enjoyed reading the ones that are less famous, that we perhaps don't think of right away. Mrs. McGinty's Dead is a favourite, Sad Cypress is a favourite, neither of which are ones that I think are in the top tier of most famous Agatha Christie stories by any stretch of the imagination. They've got lots to say, they're very original, there's a lot that's interesting in them. So I think that's what I've really enjoyed when I've been rereading Poirot, is that there are loads that aren't as famous as, say, Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile. As brilliant as they are, I think Nile is actually rather better than Murder on the Orient Express. What we've got is actually a fantastic selection of novels. Maybe one or two are not so great. It's not a bad hit rate to be maybe 95% brilliant rather than 100% brilliant.
Moving on to the big screen, who do you think was the best actor to play Poirot?
For me, I'm a David Suchet. So not quite big screen, small screen, I guess. David Suchet is the best Poirot for me. I know that lots of people think quite differently. The thing is about Poirot is that actually sometimes he is described in different ways in different books. You get some books where he's quite difficult. He doesn't find things very amusing, and where he might be very, very clinical about his sort of discussion of evidence and everything. And then there are other ones where he's basically acting like a spy. He's there when poison darts are being shot, and that he's all parts of big sort of exciting action, jumping out of a moving train. I think he does at the Big Four at one point, for example, or very close to it. So what you end up with is actually, you can pick and choose whichever aspect of Poirot you want as your characterization on screen, I think, as an actor. And for me, the David Suchet one really does the best attempt to bridge that gap between all of the very Poirot things, but also be somebody that you want to spend 100 or so hours of your time with if you're going to go and watch the entire series from beginning to end, because